One, two, three, four. When I get the chance, I got time on my hands. I'm gonna do what I can to make it known, making it known. Hello, YouTube land. It's good to be here today. My name is Anthony Scott. I am here with another episode of Making It North, a web series about people in Maine who make and create things, the things they make, how they make them, and why, and the joy that that gives them and others. Today, my guest is Dr. Helana Brigman, who is one of my colleagues at the Maine School of Science and Mathematics, someone I have a great deal of respect for. She is an author. She is a chef. She's an English literature teacher extraordinaire, and the list of things she makes and does and accomplishments and just all that she's about, well, it's a lot longer than I want to list here, and I don't think you would want to hear me list it. I think you would rather, and I know I would rather, hear it from her. Welcome, Dr. Brigman, to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It is so good to have you. I think, we both got hired to MSSM in 2017.
We did. I think, did you get hired a month before me? It was like very close together. I was hired June and you were hired May. Something
that may be accurate. I don't remember the exact timing of that. I'd already been there, doing long-term substitute positions at Maine School of Science and Mathematics 2 years in a row.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So I started becoming acquainted with everyone there to a little bit. I mean, when you're coming in that way, in a substitute, you don't really, I think Deb was the only person I really knew. McGann.
Okay.
Because she's the one who worked closely with me and Luke Shorty. But that was about it, really. So the kids, the kids are what sold me. I was like, holy cow, these are wonderful, amazing,
I know,
young, engaged, creative kids. So yeah. So we've been going through this journey over in Limestone together here for about 3 years now. And one of the things that has made the journey for me a pleasure is getting to do it beside you.
Aww.
Well, really, because I mean, you're a very positive person. You're a very creative person, which I relate to. And then, I mean, you just got a lot of knowledge and experience that's so helpful to all of our endeavors. So anyway, tell us a little bit about your background, what brings you to this place, and yeah.
Well, one of the things I always tell people when I explain, because I do have a connection to MSSM, I didn't just see this job opening and decide to apply here. In 1996, 1997, 1998, or I might be off by a year, whenever MSSM had its first summer camp, I actually attended the summer camp here. And I took astronomy with Mr. Burrs. I took photography with some gentleman who no longer works for the summer program. I learned HTML coding, I learned graphic design, and I just learned so much stuff. And so summer really became associated with, we are going to spend 1 to 2 weeks at MSSM. And then fast forward about, I think 20 years, I ended up being a PhD candidate at Louisiana State University and graduated from there with a PhD in Victorian literature and women's and gender studies. And I moved back to Maine in 2015. And it was a real struggle for me because when you're in a PhD program, you are groomed to go on the job market for the academic job market. That is the only conversation you ever have. You rarely have a conversation about, actually, I don't think I ever had a conversation with anyone about, well, what if you want to teach at the secondary level and teach a certain kind of kid or a special kind of kid while continuing to publish or while continuing to pursue other aspects of academia. So I moved back in 2015 because I knew that I didn't want to go on the job market. I wanted to teach high school and I wanted to specifically teach in Maine. And in 2015, there was actually a job opening in the English department here. There were several. And when I applied, I never heard anything. I got this like form letter from Danielle Deshane where she said, "Dear Mr. Brigman, thank you for applying, but we've already filled these positions." And as you and I know, that was probably not a good year to join the community, because it sounds like there was a lot of turnover and a lot of cultural changes. And I'm pretty grateful that I didn't come in that year. I taught at Vinyl Haven School for 2 years. And then in 2017, I saw another opening here and I said, gosh darn it, I'm going to remind them that I am an MSSM camper now, because I don't think I reminded them that. And what do you know, the next day I'm on a phone interview with Mike McCartney, Cindy Burby, Mark Tasker, and Deb McGann. And I'm just telling them, you guys, you have to hire me. You don't understand. I know what it is like to be an MSSM student, and I feel like I am the person I am today because I was an MSSM student. And then I had my teaching interview, and they offered me the job the same day. So it took about a month between the initial interview and the teaching interview. But that's how I came to MSSM, and I've been really happy ever since I got here. So it's been wonderful.
Yeah. And I think most people will pick up on this, but some may not. Generally speaking, most of the MSSM summer campers that come most of them are Maine residents. So you're actually originally from Maine.
Yes, I'm from Rockland, Maine, down east.
Yep, Rockland. And so you had an interesting kind of, itinerary through your life. You started in Maine and took a small detour to Louisiana. I started in Louisiana, and I wound up, I think, permanently, if I have my wish, in Maine.
Yeah.
So, I've been here in the northern part of the state since 2006, so I think I might be able to make that wish come true. But so it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of overlap, really, in a lot of our experiences, even though we came from like opposite ends or opposite holes.
Yeah, and I don't know if you remember this, but I was actually born in New Orleans. It's really it's kind of weird. My mom was from Maine. She was from the Thomaston, Rockland area. And my dad was from South Carolina, and he was working on an oil rig in New Orleans, and she was working at bars in New Orleans, and she became, they like met, fell in love, had children. And then pretty soon after that, we moved, my mom moved, they didn't stay together, but my mom moved us to coastal Maine. So I've always had a Louisiana connection. It was
That's
kind of interesting. Yeah.
There's all kinds of neat opportunities for creative interests and influences in that story there. Yeah. I'm right now, I just happen to be right in the middle of reading East of Eden by Steinbeck.
What an amazing book.
I love Steinbeck. But anyway, he's got me thinking, in these philosophical notions of life and how we become who we are and how that. But anyway, we won't go there. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways that your creative energy expresses itself. You're obviously a writer, you're a teacher, you're a chef, and then you do things online too, which that avenue I'm very much a novice at, and you talk.
I don't even know how to describe it sometimes, but I can talk about.
Why don't we start there at the area that I'm least familiar with, since I ended there just now, and tell us about some of those creative things you do online, and some of that has to do with your students, and you've already mentioned, I think, to me in the past you've done a podcast. So talk about some of that.
Yeah, and I'm sure there'll be a description under this video.
Oh, yeah.
So I can send you some links that sort of explain what I'm talking about. Josh, my fiance, is watching a series on YouTube by Matt Colville. He's like a big D&D person, and he says the links to what I'm talking about will be in the doodly-doo below. And so the doodly-doo will give you some description. But so I, in 2015, I was introduced. So growing up, I never was allowed to play video games. And then in 2015, I was introduced to this video game called The Lord of the Rings Online, or LOTRO for short. And it's based in Tolkien's Middle Earth. the people who work, it's a massive multiplayer online video game, and the people who develop it at Standing Stone Games just outside of Boston, they're real lore junkies. So they've written all these epic quests, and if anyone's ever played an MMO, you know that it's very lore heavy. It has a ton of like chapters and books and quests that you go through, and you follow the main characters from the lore. But what's really cool about this video game is it takes the characters from the trilogy and from The Hobbit, and it recreates their stories in new and different ways. So it's like appropriation theory. So what were Merry and Pippin doing during these chapters when we don't actually know what happened to them? And there's a really talented quest writer there, I'm going to give him a shout out, named Maid of Lions. And oh my gosh, when he writes a quest for that video game, it is like reading a book. It is so beautiful. So I was introduced to this game in 2015, and in 2018 I taught a class at MSSM called The Life and Works of J.R.R. Tolkien, or something like that. It may have actually been something slightly different. And one of my concepts for the idea was that I wanted to, as we read the books by Tolkien, I wanted my students to see the beautiful artwork and the setting that the game had developed using the books. And so I streamed every class just about for that class, and I would have the video game up in the side of the screen, or I'd have my lecture notes, and I would say, okay, in this chapter, when we see the characters, I remember very, very early on there was a moment in chapter 1 or chapter 2 or 3, I think it was chapter 2 of The Hobbit, where Bilbo runs from his house in Bag End, and he's late to meet the company that are gathered at the Green Dragon in Hobbiton. And so we actually ran the character from his house in the video game all the way down to the Green Dragon, and you can go into the Green Dragon, you can interact with NPCs, non-player characters. And so anyway, it was one of the most awesome ways to explore the map of the world, because if anyone knows like some of the theoretical conversations we have about imaginary worlds, is we talk about map making, and how in order for it to be a true secondary world, you have to actually have a map that you can truly work your way across, which the game does beautifully. And then you have to have a bunch of other things, which I won't go into. But anyway, so it was one of the ways to share a visual component of the world. And I think at the Maine School of Science and Math, we are interested in technology and in art and these different ways of thinking and seeing the world. And the best part, I already had a viewership on Twitch, which is the platform I broadcast the classes on. And anyone who's watching this will have a link where you can go and see these previous classes, and there are student presentations and all sorts of cool stuff on there. But yeah, so lots of people who watched me stream that game already would come and watch the classes, and they would get to participate in class, and they could ask questions.
Oh, that's cool.
And they also made donations to the school, which allowed the kids to go to Boston to meet the creators of the video game in March of 2019. Yeah, so it was this really wonderful community experience that the kids even got to meet some of the people who watched the classes when they were in Boston for a few days. So definitely one of the biggest things I have ever endeavored and successfully done. And I hope that one day I can teach that class again at MSSM. I'm not sure when I will, but it was really just a marvelous experience.
Yeah, that's very interesting. One thing that came to me while you were describing that was how there was this synergy of different things that you do, and different things in your past, and different things you're interested in, and how all of that came together to create this kind of new experience in that moment, right? And yeah. I think when people open themselves up to being creative, I think in a lot of ways what they're doing is they're just opening themselves up.
Yes, right? Absolutely.
They're allowing the little compartments between things to kind of dissolve, and all of a sudden they see these wonderful connections, and it creates these new combinations of things, and we call that.
Yeah. And if you're just really enthusiastic about something, I think it's contagious. I think people want to see that content, and I think kids want to learn in that way. We have a senior who's graduating now, who says to me all the time, "Can I just come back and take that class again? Because that was my favorite class at MSSM."
Wow.
And yeah, it was really cool. There's something else I wanted to say, and I completely forgot. But anyway, if it's important, it will come back to me.
Now, you said you've done podcasts and I don't know, maybe blogs too, but I know you said podcasts before.
Yeah, actually I have a blog still. It's been around since 2009. It's called clearlydeliciousfoodblog.com. I have about 500 or 600 recipes on it and
Oh,
stories and
wow.
photographs. And then I have a podcast called, actually I had two podcasts worked on, but the one that I created with a friend of mine, Russ Turley, was called Homemade is Best. And we had about 21, 22, 23 episodes back in 2012, I think is when we recorded them. And it was just a recipe podcast. It was all about cooking, and like we'd have a cheese episode or a bread episode. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, and I'm always wistful that we never really did more with that project because our lives both got so busy and we went and did other things. But I loved doing that podcast. It was great. It was like this, just sitting down and having a conversation with a friend.
Yeah, yeah. We've talked about, you had, you were born in Louisiana, then you went back to Louisiana, and then I grew up there, at least until I was about 22 before I moved away from Louisiana. But I grew up, you know, eating seafood and shrimp and crab boil. I say shrimp crab boil, it's crawfish down there. Since I moved away, crawfish can be so expensive to get all the way up here that
there's a place to get it, I can tell you.
Yeah, yeah.
Caribou. Go to, is it called Sleepers? That little corners in their freezer section. You can get crawfish there for the same price you'd get it in the frozen section for the same price you get it in Louisiana.
Oh, I see. I've seen it in there years ago, but I don't live in Caribou, so I hadn't been there very often.
Yeah. So if you ever need crawfish, that was like a real amazing experience when I discovered it there.
They're frozen already cooked or frozen raw?
I think they're frozen cooked. I don't think they're raw. It's like when you're in Louisiana and you go to any grocery store and you go to the freezer section, there's always like packaged 1 pound crawfish tails. It's whatever that is, which I think is like pre-cooked.
Yeah. Okay. And you've tried it and it's pretty good. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We made an etouffee over the winter.
All right. Good. Well, what I was going to say is, even though I grew up going to crawfish boils and all those things, whenever you hosted one here a couple of summers ago.
I know. I want to host one again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll contribute again. But we had a lot of the faculty there and we had a good time with crawfish boil. And even though I've grown up doing that and done several of them myself, especially up here, we usually with shrimp, I still learned something from you. Putting that star anise in that boil, it absolutely it's that perfect extra nuance of flavor that I was missing.
Yeah.
And if I did one actually just this past weekend with my family in Augusta, and I could not find any star anise in the store.
Oh,
it was still
I'm
good.
Sorry.
We did lobster actually. You can get lobster pretty cheap right now, by the way. Just to let you know, they were like $8 for a lobster, not per pound, for a whole lobster.
Really?
Oh my!
I wonder if those prices are up here.
Fresh out of the
really
that day. I mean, they were good. They were amazing.
Yeah. Well, I always buy star anise in bulk, so I buy everything in bulk. So I would encourage you maybe to just go get like 5 pounds of star anise, which would be pretty expensive, but you'd use it for like a really long. Like we've been using the same bag for 3 years, but yeah.
I have some in my cabinet, but I didn't think to bring. I didn't know I was going to be doing it. But anyway, I when I put that in the shrimp and crab boil now, it's that extra flavor. And so that's another great thing about surrounding yourself with creative people is creative people are curious people. They're people that want to find out what happens if I do this, right?
Absolutely.
They're always open and learning things from other creative people. So, man, life just gets better the more you're around other creative people, right?
I know.
Learn more options and ways to do things. And yeah, so you have impacted my seafood eating experience.
That is great news. And I hope that we can have more seafood eating experiences because especially in the time of coronavirus, this is like the time of year where I just want to like hang out with my family and cook. And it's, it's a little bit different. So yeah, hopefully we'll be able to do that.
Cooking side of things. And there's two ways that I know of that I see, that creativity alive in the cooking experience with you. Well, 3, I guess. First of all, we have the book, which is going to segue, I think, later into your writing.
Yes.
But then there's the recipes themselves and the food experience themselves. And then on top of that are the beautiful images and the compositions that you put together that I see they pop up on Facebook all the time. And these are gorgeous pictures. So this isn't just a a taste thing. This is a visual thing too, that I think is just an example of a cool example of how your creativity works. So talk about cooking and making that something that is not only for consumption, but for public consumption.
Sure. So I guess it would be important to preface all of this by saying that my monograph, my book project that I still haven't published, I hope to publish a chapter from it in the next year or two. That's really one of my big goals, is called A Domesticated Idea, British Women Writers and the Victorian Recipe, 1845 to 1910. And in that book, I talk about the origins of the word recipe, which comes from the Latin word recipere. And recipere means to give and to receive. So when you are reading a recipe and when you are yes, reciprocate, exactly. So when you're reading a recipe, you're in a complex process of giving and sharing knowledge. And so whenever I see a recipe, I don't think of it as a blueprint or a boring instruction manual. I think about it as part of an unseen community of shared women's or men's knowledge, typically women's knowledge, because historically recipes were written and recorded by women, and they were shared in these like communities of women, usually mothers and daughters and family members. So I wrote this book, and then this was on the heels of, so I finished that book project in 2015. And then 2 years before that, I had published this book, which has my face on it.
Which I have a copy of.
You have a copy of it. I don't really look like this. They did some weird Photoshop stuff. I look like a 45-year-old soccer mom in this picture. I hate this book cover. I say that every single time I talk about this book. But it's called The Fresh Table, Cooking in Louisiana All Year Round. And it's a collection of over, I think, 100 recipes, maybe 120, from the time when I was working at the Louisiana State newspaper, The Advocate. So I had a recipe column called Fresh Ideas. And it was based on the idea that whatever was in season or fresh and available from the farmer's market, I would develop recipes using what was in season that week at the farmer's market. So this is a byproduct of that. It's a seasonal cookbook, and it's broken down by spring, summer, fall, and winter, and it's whatever is available at that time of year. I find that incredibly handy. Some people prefer things to be just appetizers, main courses, things like that, but it's very helpful to me. Yeah, so I wrote this book, and then I don't know, what was the other thing that you meant? I feel like I'm getting off.
I was wanting to talk about your sense, not only with the cooking itself, how your creativity is expressed through the cooking and the flavor experience and the smell experience, but also then whenever you get ready to share these recipes, you don't just share them like with people that by feeding them. You're creating beautiful images.
Yes.
I mean, there's a really great sense of visual composition in those images you put on.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I took all of the photos for this book, and I used to take all the photos for my recipe column. So let me find a really good image, and we can sort of, because some of these, so my style has changed a lot since I first wrote this cookbook. And I was just doing this with a standard DSLR camera. So we've got watermelon juice on this page.
Yeah.
We've got.
Hold that up a little bit longer.
Oh, okay.
Watermelon juice. Yeah. Notice, like there's a good sense of where to have the focus of the camera. Notice how I'm talking to the readers, I think, as much as you at this point, Helena. But notice as the glasses move back into the background of the picture, they become less out of focus, and that naturally draws the eye to that front glass. And so I mean, there's a lot going on in that what appears at first glance to be a simple image, but there's a whole lot of.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I can't say I was thinking that much. I know I was trying to focus on the fullest glass that I had poured. There's also, this one is one of my favorites. It's a fig and prosciutto salad with goat cheese and spinach. I was inspired by the cover of a cookbook that I had for antipasta when I took that photo. I was trying to recreate it.
I want to try that now.
This one, oh my God, this right here is so much work to make. It's an avocado egg roll with a cashew Asian dipping sauce, and you fry the egg roll, and it is, talk about an umami experience. Oh, that's not an umami experience.
My copy of your book, I think, is stuck in my office in limestone, or my class in limestone. I've got to go get that and bring it home because my daughter, when she sees that, loves she loves Asian food of any kind, and she loves avocados.
Yeah. Well, when I give you the link to my blog, a lot of those recipes are in the blog. They're just in like the early form before they were. So this, obviously, I worked with an editor to make the recipes as clear as possible. And it was funny when I first started writing for The Advocate and developing recipes, I didn't know that there's actually an art to writing recipes. And our school is actually working on a recipe book, and I reached out to the people working on it and said, can I give you any help on this? Because there's actually like a lot of things that you kind of need to take into consideration when you're writing them. I haven't heard anything back. They'll probably just, good luck to them, and I can't wait to use the book. But like, for instance, I didn't know that you had to write your ingredients in the order in which you use them in the recipe.
Yeah, I've
I
started.
didn't know that. I had all sorts of
vaguely
recipes where I
kind
didn't
of
do
getting
that.
a sense of that because I look online sometimes for a recipe, but I had written up recipes myself just to store and pass on to my kids, and I didn't really do that, right? I just thought of the ones that were most important or whatever, right? And I
Yeah.
became aware of, yeah, I think they're doing that in the order. Yeah.
And I also didn't know that, like, if you say 1 jar of tomato sauce or 1 jar of artichokes, you say 1 space parenthesis 16 dash ounce end parenthesis jar space jar, like and then you have to indicate like what size jars you're using. When you write salt and pepper to taste, you're always supposed to capitalize the S in salt and pepper to taste.
Oh.
It's like, and these are all guidelines that are developed by the AP Association, so, that does like the Associated Press and makes recommendations for cookbook
Interesting.
authors. Yeah, so there's like all sorts of like handy little things. Yeah, so I loved writing that book. In fact, I don't know if you want to talk about future projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because one of the reasons your Facebook feed has been blowing up with my quarantine cuisine photos, as I've been calling them,
Hmm.
is because I have gotten permission to write another cookbook, but for a certain video game that I might have mentioned earlier. I
That's cool.
cannot really talk too much about it because I have to still communicate with the brand manager, and then I have to decide, do I want to go to a publisher for this, or do I want to do a GoFundMe or like a Kickstarter is actually the term for it. I'm leaning more towards Kickstarter because this book came out 7 years ago. I
Yeah.
got a $300 advancement check, and I have never seen a penny for it since.
Mm-hmm.
And it has sold pretty well. So I'm thinking I might do eliminate the third party and get my own graphic designer and get my own editor, and then just go from there, because I think it would be a better investment. And if it's a passion project, I don't think this is published by a very important press. It's published by, let's see if I can show it. Louisiana State University
Yeah.
Press, one of the oldest presses, and that's backwards on the screen, but it's one of the oldest presses in the South. And it was a really great honor to publish with them, and I think very fondly of them. But I think I might want to go a different route given the community that I would be publishing this other cookbook for. So, and one of the things to know is the community that I would be publishing for in the game has created recipes for food in Tolkien's books. And they do that through what's called a crafting system. And then they have suggested ingredients you have to have in your bag in order to make certain food items. And so what I want to do is take those recipes from the game and then convert them into real recipes for the real world. So that's like one of the things I'm doing this summer.
I love it. That is so cool.
It is so
You've got
cool.
that synergy of different things coming together there,
It
right?
is.
Yeah. So we've kind of hinted at it. This is the second time we've hinted at this. But where a creative idea comes from. In other words, you're doing what you're doing, right? Maybe you're doing streaming Lord of the Rings, the game, or maybe you're looking over your cabinet and you've got various things in your cabinet, or maybe you're reading something by Jane Austen, and you're going. But all of a sudden, you notice this little thing in there, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, I think I could, right? So talk about that process of how something all of a sudden leaps out and becomes this thing that you want to turn into reality.
I'm not sure even understand that process. I think I'm reading over something and I get an idea in my head. And then I'm like, I'm the kind of person who doesn't believe you shouldn't ask. Like, I feel like you should always ask. And an example of that is, and I should preface this by saying I definitely didn't do this, but the other day I was watching Patrick Stewart do his Sonnet a Day series that he's been doing on social media to sort of lift people's spirits during the quarantine. And I've decided that, it's really hard. I don't want to fit in sonnets in just 1 or 2 days in the fall when I teach my Shakespeare course. I thought it would be really nice if we could start every day with a 2-minute video from Patrick Stewart where he just reads a sonnet. And he's Patrick Stewart, and he's lovely, and he's a talented Shakespearean actor. And that way the kids will be exposed to the sonnets in the way that they're meant to be exposed. Theoretically, the sonnets were meant to be read by a private audience, but poetry is meant to be read out loud. So this is just a long way of saying, I was sitting there watching these videos, and I was thinking, I wonder if I messaged the Patrick Stewart Facebook page, if I would get a response. If I asked them, I'm going to be using these in my classroom, or I tell them I'm going to be using these in my classroom, and I ask them, would Patrick be willing to speak to my students about the value of online performance in the age of the coronavirus? I couldn't get it to work on my phone, which is why I never did it. But that's a really good example of you need to ask. Like, and I have done that in so many ways in my life, in my career. I wasn't given a recipe column by the Advocate. I asked the food editor if I could write a recipe column for her. I didn't actually propose this book. I was contacted by the press to write this book. That's maybe one of the few instances where they asked me. But I think that that's just like a really important part of the creative process, because sometimes you need to give yourself permission to create something, and sometimes you need help in that process. So as I'm talking about this, I now feel like I need to go message the Patrick Stewart Facebook page and see if I can even get a response. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a similar experience back for the January term. I thought about, we did do a theater J term, and I thought I was going to potentially do an actual stage production of a section of The Empire Strikes Back. That book that takes and writes, a Star Wars movie, one of the Star Wars movies, that does in a Shakespearean script and presents it and writes it in a format that looks like a play, but it's actually not a full-blown play script because they don't have stage direction, all that stuff, right? But I thought, well, it's almost, wouldn't it be fun to convert that, right? And so I reached out to that author to ask permission, and he was like, well, listen, it doesn't matter to me. He responded really quickly. He was really nice. He says, I would love for someone to do that. I think it's great. He says, but what I've run into is it's not easy to get permission from Lucasfilm.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. So yeah, you do run into roadblocks like that. Now you've spoken exclusively in that particular comment. It was really about publishing, using, combining others' materials, or getting published by a particular press, or working through another entity to publish your recipe column. But you prefaced all that. I'm not really sure how that process works. I think it is a little bit mysterious always, and maybe that's the reason at different times in man's history, when we have these ideas that come to us, it feels like there's some outside force, right? And we've called it the muse. Some people have called it being inspired by God, or almost, right? Because it feels so outside. It feels like something so cool and fascinating and beautiful, and it feels like it's just coming to us in that moment. But I think it's very much a product of our intuitive, side, I think.
Yeah, and actually that reminds me of something. In your notes for today's episode, you were talking about, like, how did you word it? Something about creativity. Is it just talent, something you're born with? And
maybe that was under big ideas, and it was myth number 2.
Yes, I love this idea about creativity myths. Like, so myth 1, only some people are creative. Myth 2, creativity is just talent, something you're born with. Myth 3, making a thing is creative if it is considered art. So those first 2 myths seem very important to me. And I ended up Googling, do you know the author Elizabeth Gilbert of Eat, Pray, Love? The book Eat, Pray, Love?
Yes, I'm
Okay.
not real familiar with it, but I do know what you're talking
Yeah, so she has one of the most watched TED Talks on creativity, your elusive genius, or your elusive creative genius. And in the beginning of it, she talks about how back in the olden times,
about.
2,000 years ago, we all believed that creativity came to you from an external force, and how great it was to be a writer during that time, because if you were a writer, it took all the pressure off your shoulders of, I have to create something good. I'm creating it. I'm personally responsible for it. Because instead, it was just like the muse of X, Y, or Z is coming and sprinkling it over your brain. And how that was like, historically, that must have been a liberating process. And actually, I just read to my daughter the myth, the Norse myth about creativity. It was originally that creativity was this mead that had a certain special sauce in it. I won't say what it was because it's a Nord myth and it's very violent, but which I read to my daughter. But the special sauce was, if you took one sip of this mead of poetry, you would just spew beautiful poetry. And then there's this hilarious story about why some people spew bad poetry and why some people spew good poetry. One being that, actually, I won't go into it because it's gross and it involves a fart joke. But I encourage people to look this up if they do watch this episode, and look up why some good and bad poetry, and specifically the Norse myth of the
Wow,
mead, MEAD, of poetry.
that's interesting. That's interesting. Now I can't wait to look that up.
Yeah.
Um, so you have touched on, especially when you were talking about how your creativity expresses itself online. You touched on how that impacted the classroom.
Mm.
I'd like to revisit the classroom though, because there's a lot of cool things that go on in your classes and in your room. Um, that is definitely your creative side coming out. And there's day-to-day stuff on it, that you do, every week and every month in whatever class. But then there's also special things that you've done and we'll do more of, I know. For instance, there's the Regency Ball, and
My
how much,
ball.
yeah, I mean, there was just creativity and collaboration and just a lot of cool things that made that happen. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so this is also, so in the spring of last year when I took the kids to Boston to meet the creators of Standing Stone Game, at the same time I was also teaching my first year of Victoria's literature. So I mentioned earlier I have a PhD in Victorian literature, and the syllabus that I had built for our school was a Victorian literature syllabus, but it was aligned with a different idea. It was aligned with the idea that Queen Victoria lived from 1819 until 1901. So she lived for the bulk of the 19th century, which is why we call it the Victorian age. And so when you look at the literature from that time period, it lines up so interestingly with important moments in her life. So when we read about coal mining factories in Dickens, we can also go to her diaries and say, here are these entries that deal with the coal mining, her visits to the coal mining factories. So there's like a lot of primary sources that we can tie into the secondary literature. So all that being said, that was the scope of the course. And one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to teach the kids about 19th century tailoring and mechanization, and specifically how industrialization changed the what is the industry? I guess what is the
Textile.
industry? Textile. Thank you. The textile industry. And we started the course by reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which is theoretically it is a romantic text because it comes out in 1813 and was written during the 1790s when she was a girl. Obviously, she revised it when she printed it in 1813. But in that book, the most important moment in the entire book, you can argue what it is, but I would argue that it is the moment at which all the characters come to the ball at the very beginning. And you have the butting of heads and between Mr. Darcy and the main character, Elizabeth Bennet. And so much of what happens in the novel is based on the moment at that ball. And so I said to the kids at the end of this year, because it was a year-long course last year, this year when I teach it, it'll be a semester course. I said to my students, I said, we're going to figure out basically the inner workings of this ball, why it's so important. And we're going to do that from the perspective of textiles. And so I want all of you to sew this. Now that I think back at it, this was sort of a crazy thing for me to ask my students, but I told them, you're all going to sew your own dresses and jackets. I'm going to help you. And then we're going to have a ball, and we're actually going to learn how to do real Regency style dancing like they did in the scene. We're going to eat real Regency style food, and it's going to be this big event that we put on at the end of the school year. I am not for the faint of heart as a teacher. I go big or I go home. As I think it, I look back at these things and I think that I can't believe that I did it. But yeah, so we spent 2 hours on Mondays and Tuesdays in my classroom every week for the entire school year sewing. And it was so much fun. So SEW, so much fun.
It was. I went to the
Yeah.
ball at the end of the year, and I got to see that dancing and how they did it. And I did not know much about that style of community dancing really before that, and how much of a community event it was. It was.
Yes.
It wasn't some thing that was done exclusively by people who were very limber and very talented and had a beat, like dancing is. We think of dancing today a lot of times in this sense of you got to be good at it to do it, right? I'm not good at dancing. I can't move that way. But that style of dancing, as long as you knew the form, pretty much anyone could do it.
Absolutely.
And it was about community building and about coming together and enjoying each other's company. And wow, that sounds like a kind of a poignant commentary on what we're going through right now, doesn't it?
I was just thinking that, and I was also thinking the way in which so when I was teaching that class, I think overall the ball was pretty popular with the kids. We had a couple kids who were like, this is stupid. Why did I only took this course because it fit my schedule? But by the end of the year, I think they understood the book. They understood the society, they understood the culture, they understood all of it in a way that was so experiential and was so meaningful. And that's really the goal of a project like that. At one point I had a colleague, and I forgive her for making this comment, but she said, why do the kids have to make their own outfits? The class is so girly. And I'm thinking, that's a really superficial way of understanding what we're trying to accomplish when we talk about actually reading a book, understanding what people wore on a daily basis, trying to recreate what they wore, trying to think the way they thought, trying to dance the way they danced, trying to talk, trying to eat. It's really an immersive experience. And I think that today, as we go through the coronavirus and our quarantine, I appreciate that we were able to have that kind of experience more than maybe I did last year, because it was a great community event. And if you go into my classroom, you'll see there's this framed picture of me and my students and the dance instructor and my fiance and like everyone and I think you're in the, I don't know if you are in the photo. You may have snuck out before we took it. But yeah. So anyway, I think that those.
Yeah, actually I remember being in the picture.
Oh, okay. I just don't. I can see.
I was in a picture. I know a picture was taken with my daughter and me. But maybe
I just don't think. Yeah, maybe it's in one of the other photos. So Dr. Hamlin, who took the pictures, he had trouble with the lighting that evening, so we ended up not getting a ton of photos because guess what? Candlelight, not ideal for photography.
Yeah, it was dim. There's a lot dimmer light source. I remember the dimness being in the room there. Yeah. Oh man. What better way to become intimately familiar with the fabric of society than working with the fabric of society?
I love that you said that. And actually, if I remember, I'm going to put that in my syllabus, because if I ever do that project again, which I foresee possibly being brave enough to undertake that again in the future, I think that's exactly the point. Like I want you to understand the fabric of society. And that was such a good experience. I enjoyed that class so much.
Yeah, and it's a tactile. It's using a totally new sense, rather than just eyes and ears. But it's a tactile sense. First of all, in the feeling of the cloth and in the motion of the hands and creating the garment, and then in the wearing of it and the movement of the dance, man, I mean, it's using the whole, all the senses. You had the food in there, so you had the sense of smell and taste as well. It's really learning through all the senses, and and appealing to the whole person. I don't know. I know boundaries are necessary for some things. Our little boxes and taxonomy and classifications, and I know it helps us navigate the vast universe of knowledge that we've collected over the centuries. But man, at the end of the day, part of me hates them.
Yeah.
Because I have the most fun when I'm able to blur that boundary and create this interesting exchange between things on each side. Like, for instance, the whole notion of it being a feminine notion to create clothing. First of all, the last name Taylor comes from a history of men who tailored, right?
That's 100% correct. Yes.
And I've actually toyed over the years with getting a sewing machine, not because I'm real interested in just making clothing or other things. It's just occasionally I have these creative projects or notions that hit me, and I realize the tool that would help me make that thing would be a sewing machine. Right?
You should get one. I mean, their $100 sewing machine will probably last you forever. And like, look at right now. I've sewed you face masks. I mean, it's such a useful, it's a tool. I mean, ultimately it's a tool.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. It's a tool. And I know I would enjoy that because I like making things. I have power tools and other things that I love. And they're just because they're tools. And one area that shows how, Lord, I'm glad I ignored that boundary is I love to cook too. I get a lot of joy out of cooking and sharing my creations with my family and friends. And that's been considered in America at times a feminine thing to do. And I'm so glad I ignored that. It's so, don't get me started.
I know. So I have a degree in gender studies as well. And I think that, I was listening to a child psychologist on a podcast that I enjoy. And she was saying that when she deals with parents who are trying to understand their children, they'll often say, oh, did this child make that choice or act that way because it's a boy and my other child is a girl? And she said, in 98.2% of the cases that I work with, gender has nothing to do with it. And one of the things that we say in gender studies is we say that gender has to do with everything. But it's only really the perceived idea of gender, because gender is it's a construct. It's something that we have created based on our biological sex. So gender has very little to do with anything. And I love that you said that about cooking, because think about it, like you and I wouldn't have enjoyed a crawfish boil together, probably, or we might have enjoyed it in a very different way if you and I didn't get to collaborate on what went into that crawfish pot. Because when you think about what goes into the pot, that is a creative act.
Yeah, absolutely. And the pot is a great example of these different things dissolving to becoming one thing, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Something hit me. Oh, I constantly have, I feel like sometimes I have an idea a minute, right? And a bunch of them are so nutty or silly that they could never happen, but occasionally I pull off one or two, and but like right now I have this giant idea. I don't even know how I would do it. I'm going to have to try to find someone who can do it.
What's the idea?
The idea is a walk-in reverse globe.
Reverse in what way? Because I'm liking it. I'm just not sure I know.
Yeah, and I forget where the idea hit me in conversation this weekend. The interior, you walk in, it's a giant sphere. You walk in, and on the outside, it would be like it would be painted like a matte black where it didn't reflect light, and it would actually be a three-dimensional view of constellations. Like you'd walk around it, and pinpoints of light would be coming out of it. So the exterior would be constellations at night. That was all you would see, but you would be looking at it as a large sphere rather than looking at above you, around you.
Do you know what I thought you were saying, and that's why I got so confused. I've been thinking a lot about Shakespeare lately, and I thought you were referring to the Globe Theater.
I know.
But you're referring to something else. You're talking about the night sky.
Right. Well, then you walk into the thing, and inside you have the continents and everything laid out around you, except they're inverted because they're the inside the ball, right? Anyway, I don't know how I would pull that off, but that's okay. It's okay because it's fun to think about, and occasionally if I run into something I can do, then I reach out to people who know how to do that. Like I'd reach out to people who know how to do construction. I'd reach out to Mr. Burrs to get the constellations right.
I was going to say, this is something our MSSM students could figure out how to do. One of our seniors who's graduating put on their Facebook profile about him that he considers himself a woodworker, and I know he does because he and I have had very detailed conversations about the stuff he's built.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
He's a creative person for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we absolutely could. It'd be a cool exhibit too, a cool thing to make the campus, stand out as something, and I think the county could, just like we've gotten some benefit from the giant solar system that goes from Prescott all the way, I think, to Holton.
Oh yeah.
And it's the more things you can do like that to bring in and be one of a kind things that you can bring tourists to, it creates a little bit of revenue and a little bit of interest in our place.
Yeah,
I
instead
find
of
it
making
funny.
people think that we're just like up there in the middle of nowhere,
Yeah.
which is definitely like I mean, we are up there in the middle of nowhere, but it's definitely a sort of negative perspective that I hear all the time about, oh, you live in the county.
Yeah, it's like in not being said there's this implication where there's nothing up there, right?
Right.
And
And actually, I think there's so much up here. And the best part, I finally at 34 years old, got my passport for the first time. And because back in the day, you used to be able to cross into Canada using your birth certificate. Now they prefer your passport. But I got it right before the coronavirus. And I think of, our proximity to Canada as being like this really, I can't wait to go out over to Canada and eat at the different restaurants, send my child to summer camp. So we're Canada adjacent. We're not
that's
in the
right.
middle of
Actually,
nowhere.
right across that border, there are some actually fairly large cities and towns that, there's a lot going on over there. I've got to get my passport too. I haven't been over there since you had to start having passports.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. But I think the county, what I've found, and I'm sure it's not just the county, maybe it's just because I've gotten to know people and gotten plugged into creative people here. But man, there's a lot of creative energy and different people doing poetry, people doing music, people doing art up here, writing things. There's, I've been a part of writers circles up here. There's a lot of creative energy up here. And I don't know, I would just feel like this is a great place for that to happen. It just feels like a place where creative people have the freedom to be creative,
Absolutely. Yeah. And often I always think about like the stereotypes of the creative type.
Uh,
And you think of them as someone who's like got a little cottage by the sea, like Hemingway or Fitzgerald, but really farmland. That's where the creative people are. Farmland.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I did the last Making It North video I did with Kim Smith and Craig Green, who were in the Prescott Historic Society. And one thing that came out during my tour, they gave me a tour of the Maysville Museum, which is this beautiful little award-winning restoration project they did for a building that was the town hall, schoolhouse, and the Grange Hall for what used to be a town, which has now been absorbed by Presque Isle. It doesn't even have a town there anymore. But it was an important institution there, the central of an actual town called Maysville. And one of the things that came out were all these different ways that people up here caught in this place where they can be so remote. And you can go long periods of time without seeing anyone from anywhere else, because back then it was quite an undertaking to make it up here from Holton or from Bangor. I mean, you get in a wagon and horse and the roads weren't paved, and if there were roads at all, I mean, it was hard life. And so they found creative ways to make life, beautiful and bearable. For instance, there was this creative farm implement. They were loading potatoes in barrels. And of course, they're huge and they're heavy. And then they're trying to put them on traditional wagons, except they're having to hoist them up so high because they got to be, the bed had to be above the axle's height. So guess what they did? An individual, I think Tabor was his last name. He says, you know what? I think I can come up with a way to have a dropped axle where the bed sits low and we can load more potatoes on there and without breaking our backs. And
Whoa.
yeah, he started seeing these parts and things and needs, and the creative juices came flowing together, and the pot pulled out the Tabor drop bearing axle. So yeah, it's a creative place to live and be. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you have some You mentioned one future project. You got anything else on the burner?
Yep. Literally and less literally. So literally, I have a 2-pound pork butt that I'm going to put on the grill for 5 hours this afternoon
There
after
you
this phone
go.
call. Less literally, I have been invited to contribute to the Encyclopedia of Victorian Women Writers. So I'm printing 3 entries for them. One on Eliza Acton's 1845 cookbook, Modern Cookery in All Its Branches, which is the cookbook that I think everyone needs to know about. It is the first cookbook designed for middle-class women readers. She was a former poet who decided to go from poetry to recipes because she had to. Her publisher wouldn't print another volume of poetry for her, but he said that if you would write me a very good cookery book, I'd be happy to publish it for you. And so I theorize that the reason, when we look at recipes, the reason we have ingredients lists, because she invented the ingredients list. Ingredients used to be part of the recipes instructions. So she decided to pull out each of the recipes ingredients, create the table. And I argue that it's because she was a poet and she was used to seeing things in that format. They look like one long stanza. So I'm contributing an article on that cookbook, and I've got 2 other women cookbook authors that I'm not as familiar with. I'll be writing about them, and then this is very appropriate for MSSM. I have been invited by a professor at the University of Connecticut to contribute to his book on experiential Victorian teaching. And I'm working on an article right now on my MSSM J term from January of last year, where we learned how to read, write, and cook the Victorian recipe. So using the cookbook, one of the cookbooks I just mentioned. And so I'm writing an article about that class that I taught for him for that volume, which should be out, I think, in 2021. I think it'll be published by Paul Grabe in 2021.
Very cool. Very cool. I'm gonna have to get my copy. Yeah. So to everyone out there in YouTube land, you can see that, I've already done an interview with Mr. Burrs, by the way, with Larry Burrs.
Yay! He's my
So for all
favorite.
of you out there in YouTube land, you can see that I'm a pretty lucky person to get to work with some amazing people here. So I mean, they're engaged, they're curious, they're full of energy, and yeah, and that's the way creative people are. You mentioned the myths on the what I call the Making It North cheat sheet that I give out to all the interviewees, and that's only certain people are creative. And just the excitement of a new idea, of making it real, of collaborating with others, of sharing it with others, all of that stuff that you've been talking about, that other interviewees have talked about. These people are excited people. These people are looking forward to the next day, right? They're getting up and thinking, oh, in fact, a part of me, sometimes I have a hard time going to sleep because I do go to sleep. I value sleep because that's when my brain gets refreshed. And I know I'm sharper and I can do better work when I wake up. But a part of me is like, oh man, I hate to go to bed because I really want to do this, But then I wake up saying, okay, today I get to do this.
Yeah.
And I think there are so many people out there that don't get up with that joy. They don't get up with that anticipation and looking forward to, I get to try this today. I get to experiment with this and make this. And I really want to knock down that myth that, you got to have some special talent or to have something special to be a creative person. Because I see people creating all the time that don't think they're creative. It's just, they don't realize that is a valuable part of themselves. It hasn't been valued by others in them, and they've been discouraged. I don't know. But anyway, everyone else who's watching here, look how excited and happy and anticipatory these people that I'm interviewing, including Dr. Brigman, are. You can do that. You can have an idea. Your ideas are worthwhile. Pursue them, try them out, experiment, and play. It's like, we're making stuff. Dr. Brigman is making stuff that is useful and insightful. And yet, don't you get the sense of that, Helena, that at the same time you're kind of playing too?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it reminds me of something I say to my daughter all the time. She's only 7.5, almost 8 months old, but often I'll put her in the high chair and put her next to the kitchen island while I'm preparing dinner. And I'll say to her, I can't wait till you can play with me, until like you and I can actually cook something in the kitchen together. We're gonna make a mess. You're probably gonna get burned at some point. There's gonna be tears. There's gonna be laughter. It's gonna be wonderful. It's gonna be terrible at times, but we'll get to experiences together. And, I think that that's like a really important perspective that you need to have about creativity, that so many things are creative acts if you allow them to be creative acts.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I have had an awesome time. This
Me
interview
too.
has been everything I
We
hoped.
never get to sit down and talk like this. I think
No.
this is really fabulous.
I know it's always within the framework of work and tasks that we have to
Yeah.
do
Oh my
for
God, have you posted your grades? Oh my God, did you see that email? Now, I want to talk about that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, if the coronavirus allows for it in the future, we do need to do another crawfish boil.
Oh,
So,
yes. And actually, your name came up today when Josh saw me seasoning I made a beautiful seasoning for this pork butt that we're about to have some beautiful pork. Anyway, we're going to make carnitas. And yeah, but I was like rubbing it and Josh was like, man, wouldn't it be nice to have Anthony's backyard set up with that like, I don't know, what would you call it? Like an outdoor grill, outdoor
I call it a
oven that
pit
you built?
grill. I call it pit grill.
Yeah.
It's one of those crazy cinder blocks, and I designed some, a piece of plate steel. I didn't do it myself because I don't have those skills, but once I knew my dimensions, I ordered from a local fabricator. But a big giant
Nice.
sheet that makes a flat grill, and then I have the two great grills on either side. Yeah, this is a giant pit. It's
God, this
wonderful.
would be perfect for so maybe that we should just make a date to use your grill and we'll get like something beautiful and just like grill it forever and then eat it.
Yeah, absolutely. We could do that. We could do that. Absolutely.
That would be fun.
Yeah, it will be. Well, I'm sure I will be talking to you again really, really soon.
Yes,
I hope-
absolutely. Probably later today. Who knows? We're probably on the same email chains.
Probably so. Probably so. But it was really wonderful to get to talk to you in this less structured and more, kind of fun format. But take care of yourself. Stay safe. And I can't wait to talk to you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would love being here. I can't wait to see the episode.
Bye-bye.